right. That's good.
It laid on the console, wasn't it? What you been up to? Get your hands in your pocket?
Uh, just staying warm as best I can.
I got warm on the go moving chickens.
Did you get them moved?
Yeah,
To their Taj Mahal.
They found a home, huh?
down the hole. They in there flying all over the place.
Getting cabin fever pretty bad.
Okay, we are going to go back kind of old school today, and we're basically, if you got your Bible, you're in good shape. So we won't worry about some of the other. I'll have some
Kings, what?
Well,
7?
yeah, we'll eventually be First Kings 8, but we're going to back up just a hair to First Kings 6 right now. But we'll be back to 8 real quick. I'm just going to point out some things. So I think I mentioned either last week or the week before that let me just check something. I want to make sure that I am getting sound of this.
Like week before when Larry.
Yeah, and last week we talked about the probably the thing that showed Solomon's, I guess, his wisdom. Last week we talked about. Yep, I got good sound. Okay, I was just checking. So we talked about that. You know, how he did the two harlots. Basically, one of them's baby died in the middle of the night, and she tried to take the other baby, and of course Solomon's wisdom was able to figure out a way to know which baby it was. But we're getting into the temple, and so we're going to spend some time on this because the temple is very important. I'm going to have some diagrams, and I don't like some of the pictures I've seen, and so I'll probably just make my own. But the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. Now, you know, in one sense, I think, I know growing up, King James Bible, it's the tabernacle. And I think we think of it differently because of that word, tabernacle. But all tabernacle means is tent. And so the newer translation a lot of times will say tent of meeting or tent. And that's indeed what it was. It was meant to be portable. Why did it need to be portable in the early days when the law was given?
They moved a lot.
Moved a lot, yeah. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and so it needed to be able to go wherever they were. They were nomadic, I guess you would call that. And so it needed to be portable. But at some point now, you know, now they've got, they're on their third king. They're no longer transitory. They have the land. In fact, you know, Jews still live in Israel. In fact, you know, don't really want to get into anything political, but a lot of what's discussed about modern day Israel is just erroneous or inaccurate. For example, you probably have heard, well, the Palestinians were displaced. That's not really quite accurate in that way that's presented. First of all, the term Palestine. Does anyone know when that came up?
What?
The term Palestine, when that term even originated from? It really didn't have anything to do with the people, by the way. It had to do with the land. It was when that area became under Roman occupation, and that whole region was called Palestine. Now, the bulk of it was occupied and was mainly Jewish people at that time. There were some Samaritans and others that were there, and some miscellaneous others, but Rome's the one that labeled that Palestine. So, in one sense, there really aren't what you'd call Palestinian people. They've lived there a long time, but the people that we tend to refer to as Palestinians are basically Arabs, Arabic in background, and they have lived in that area. However, the Jewish people, in some form or fashion, some number, sometimes it's larger, sometimes it's been smaller, they've lived in that general area since the time of uh, uh, Joshua, since they occupied the land. And so, in fact, the Jewish people have been generally the largest population of people for just about all the time. It is erroneous to say that the Jewish people displaced Palestinian people. In fact, in that the strictest sense of that term, from a historical standpoint, they all were Palestinian because they all were under Roman occupation at one point. However, it was after World War I where Great Britain, England came up with a plan for different areas for the people to live, so they wouldn't fight and other things. And that really has been the case really since modern times. And World War II just recognized Israel as a separate nation, is what it did. It really didn't do much anything else that was already in place. And so, anyway, so that area has been occupied by Jewish people or Israelites, Hebrews, whatever you want to refer to them as, since that time. And yes, indeed, there are other people that live there now. By the way, the only free Palestinians, they always talk about free Palestine and everything. The only free Palestinians are citizens of modern day Israel, which I think is funny. There's over, I think it's a little less than 25% of the population are what they'd call Palestinian, and they vote. They are part of the parliament. They go to school. The women can go to school and all this other things. So the only free Palestinians are actually the ones that are citizens of Israel, which is just kind of ironic because Palestine's not really had the best of leadership, the ones that want to take it over. In fact, most of the history of the quote Palestinian movement has been terrorist people, much like Hamas, that is doing their evil things they're doing. I don't know if y'all saw when they released the bodies of the two babies and they paraded them around celebrating the fact that they had killed two babies. Just horrific. And that's the people that some people are trying to celebrate, even in the U.S., that, hey, they need to have their own land, be free. They were given their own land. Actually, Gaza was given to them, and they messed that up so much that Israel had to kind of surround it with. Anyway, it's just ironic what people like to celebrate. But anyway, Israel's been there since then. So they were a settled people. And so at this point, David wanted to build a temple, wasn't allowed to because of his history, his background as a warring type person, shed too much blood. And then, but he would do all the preparation, and Solomon would build the temple. So that's where we're at. We talked about, I knew a guy that he was an elder at church in Georgia, the Georgia school preaching I went, and he had done he built church buildings for a living. And he had done a detailed accounting, like if he was going to bid the project as a contractor. And I think back in around 2000, he came up with a price tag of around $8 billion with a B dollars. And you say, well, there's more expensive buildings today. Some of these lavish football stadiums. I wouldn't be surprised if that place that Jerry Jones built where the Cowboys play probably costs something like that. But the difference is the size. So I roughly walked it off, just some rough measurements. It's what I remembered. Our main building over there, okay? It's a good sized building, but it's not a huge building by any means, But so in comparison to the temple, now the only thing the one thing I will say, the temple was taller. The temple was probably about, let's see, somewhere we got dimensions for it. Let's see. 30 cubits high. So it was about 45 feet tall. Our building isn't 45 foot tall. So it would have been taller. Our building's, I guess what, maybe 30, 35, if you go from the outside dimensions. So it was taller. But in relation to the temple, what size do you think our building is to what the temple would have been? Now that would have included the holy place, the most holy place. Wouldn't the stuff that was inside? It wouldn't have considered, how that altar, which was outside, and all the, the court of the ladies and stuff like that. But it would have included anything that was enclosed. So, how big do you think our building is compared to the temple?
Probably pretty close.
Pretty close. You want to say pretty close size? What?
I figure the temple was smaller than our building.
Okay, how much smaller?
About 1/3 smaller.
1/3 smaller, so about 2/3 the size of our building. Okay, anybody else want to take another guess? Okay, I roughly calculated our building, and this may surprise you, but now this includes classrooms, includes the old activity area, includes the foyer and everything. If you count everything that's enclosed, I'm not counting upstairs either, I'm just counting the base floor, it's roughly 6,000 square feet. Okay, I don't know if that's bigger than you thought, smaller than you thought, or what. Now, the auditorium is probably only about maybe 4,000, maybe less than that, maybe 3,500. But the overall building is about 6,000 square feet. The temple was 2,700 square feet. So our building is more than twice as big as what the temple was. This activity building we're in, it's about between maybe 1,850, something like that, square feet. So it's smaller, but I just wanted to point that out because it's almost exactly the width, like the way it would have been if you're looking at it this way. That's how wide the temple was. It was longer than this building, but this is how wide it was. So it puts it in perspective. We're not talking about why wouldn't it have been bigger? This is the temple of the most holy God. Why wouldn't this be bigger? By the way, Solomon also builds his palace. It wasn't like a palace we'd think of. It had a lot of this really nice wood. It probably smelled good. All these cedars and stuff like that. But Solomon's palace was, I think, roughly 3,500 square feet. Solomon's palace was bigger than the temple. How does that make sense?
That's something to do with what people would determine to be inside.
Okay. I think you're on something there, yes. So who would actually be in the temple? When we talk about the temple itself, who would be the people inside the temple?
Just the priest.
Just the priest. And they actually, David set up the divisions so they would take turns on who would be there. So you would have, maybe 2 or 3 priests in there burning the incense and doing that type of things. And this most holy place, how often was it occupied?
High priest once a year.
Once a year. So one person would be where this most holy place was once a year. And so in that comparison, it was huge for being, you only had a couple, 2, 3 people in it at any time. So it wasn't it was huge if you look at it from that standpoint. There just wasn't a lot of people that was in it. Now, the outer areas, they could hold a bunch of people, but it was open air and everything. But I just want to point that out. So the fact that around $8 billion, if you wanted to equate it, of course, that's probably at least double or triple that today, what that would cost to build, how ornate and lavish it was. And yet, for the most part, no one ever saw it, except for the outside, how beautiful it looked, how majestic. You can imagine it wasn't that big, but it was tall. Especially for back then, a 45-foot tall building was a pretty tall building for back in that day. And bear in mind the geography. Um, you know, let's see. I think I got a map somewhere here in the BAP. Let's see.
I don't know how long the big the barn was. It had 40,000 dogs or horses.
Yeah, it was a big one. I wonder if he had a chicken coop.
I doubt it.
I don't know.
Had to make room for them horses.
So if you look at map 10, if you go back to your maps, map 10. Everybody get to map 10. It's the city of Jerusalem in New Testament times is what it's called. Okay. So now, first of all, you see all these walls on there, and a lot of these walls were added on at a later date. You probably have to read some of the lines or some of the things to see, where it would have been. It was much smaller in the Solomon's time. However, what really I wanted you to look at this about is you see the temple and how it's oriented, and you see the altar there. You can see the different courts and everything, but look to the right, and now y'all's may not have y'all's a little bit more zoomed in, but Gethsemane. Now, what was significant about Gethsemane, and where was Gethsemane located? On what mount was it located? Still there to this day. In fact, the Garden of Gethsemane is still there to this day. What kind of trees are there? And that's one thing. If I ever get a chance, I'd love to go up there and just pray and meditate where the Lord would do the same thing. And the trees that are there, some of them are well over 2,000 years old. Some of those very trees were there when Jesus would go there and pray. Now, it's on Mount Olives, or Olivet, Mount of Olivet.
That was where Jesus rested.
It was, yeah. That's where he was. He prayed, and then when he said it's after he third time, and they fell asleep every time. And he said, basically, don't worry about it. Time's up. And that's when Judas came with the whole legion, it says, but it probably wasn't quite that many, but it was a ton of soldiers for one man that didn't carry a weapon. And so but that's where Jesus, if you go back, you can see he went there quite often. That's where he would go a lot of times to be alone and pray. But if you are at there and you look across, to the west, you see where the temple's at. Now, the map does a little bit of it, but you almost have to know how maps are, and not everybody, I guess, has that type of background. But you've got this Kidron Valley, and there's the Kidron Creek and everything. So where Gethsemane is a little bit higher, actually, than where Mount Moriah. We're going to see it's also referred to as Mount Zion, but the Temple Mount. But they're similar height. And so as a result, because you got this big, huge valley that goes down, if you look across, you can see the temple, or where the temple would have been. Now there's this golden dome for Islam, one of Islam's most holy places. But that temple, and it had some spires, and it was 45 foot tall. And of course, you had the pinnacle of the temple, which was really high. But so you could see this ornate, beautiful temple from there. The reason I point this out, because this is well before Jesus' time that Solomon builds it, but anybody coming towards Jerusalem, what would they have seen before they saw anything else? From all directions, as they was entering and getting close to the city, what would they see? The temple. I like when we go up Fayetteville area. There's a place when you're on the interstate and you can see the school. You can see the old main building. That's the one I think stands out. You can see the football stadium too, but you can see it from a long ways off. And that's the way it would have been with the temple. I mean, it was so impressive. It was built on a high point and it was ornate. Imagine that gold glistened when the sun shined on it. And you could see it for miles before you ever got there. And so it was a focal point. And so I wanted to point that out. By the way, in map 9, it actually shows the temple. It shows the same Kidron Valley, but you see the royal palace, how it dwarfs
Yeah.
it kind of dwarfs the temple there. So, but it wouldn't have been as impressive. This temple was overlaid with gold and other things, and so I just wanted to point that out because it would have been just amazing to have seen.
The Kidron Valley where a lot of David's battles was fought.
Well, I don't know about
Yeah.
battles, but that's where, if you remember, when Adonijah tried to declare himself king,
Yeah.
he went down the Kidron Valley, and you wouldn't have been able to see from the city proper. Now, if someone had been in Gethsemane, they would have probably been able to see that because you'd been that high up. But yeah, there is a lot that takes place in the Kidron Valley. So you'll see it over and over. The biggest thing though is so how did Jesus get around in his day? Walked. So he would come, you recall where Jesus normally stayed when he was in Jerusalem for the feast days, where he would stay? What town would he stay in?
He's got
This map is a little bit different than yours,
Mm-hmm.
and I was wondering where you were telling me the temple was.
Yeah, it's not on that. That's not the same
Uh,
map. Yeah.
this one is.
Yeah.
Well, I seen
Yeah.
it on that
Yeah.
one. I
Yeah.
thought he
No,
had map 9 where they had
Well,
the-
yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's
no extra
You're-
or something there.
well, I think they got one less. They got
One
less
less.
maps. It's so the downside, we discovered that on the large print ones, they don't have some of the archaeological data, and they've got just a few less things. But they've got newer maps, because that's a newer map. That's a little bit cleaner map on the temple, the Jerusalem area. But the point is, when Jesus was around, he walked, right? Now, where did Jesus stay most of the time when he would come to Jerusalem? He wouldn't stay in Jerusalem. He would stay in a town that was, a little over 2 miles away. Now, it's where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. What town was that? Anybody remember? Bethany. So he would stay in Bethany. And so, well, what would he have to do then? Every day he'd go to, like his last week before he's crucified, he would go into Jerusalem every day. So he would start from Bethany. He would go around where the Mount of Olives was. And what do you do immediately once you leave the Mount of Olives? Go down to that Kidron Valley, and then you'd have to go back up. And by the way, I have seen diagrams and everything. The way you would get into Jerusalem, they had gates and other things, but then you had to go up these enormous stairs, steep, to get up to where the Temple Mount area was. So, well, let's just say they probably were a little bit better shape than what we are today. Having to do that, and they would do it. He did it every day, and so anyway, just trying to give some picture to the way it would have looked. But the temple was something that it stood out. It was very ornate. And, it talks all these chapters about all the furnishings and everything. So let's go ahead and move to chapter 8. Chapter 8 of 1 Kings. Yes. Yes. and we'll see that everything is ready. Now, if you're building something of nature, so in other words, say the Dallas Cowboys decide to move to Booneville, Arkansas. Strange things have happened. And so what would we have to have in order for a football team to play here? Well, we'd have to have a stadium, yeah. So if you was building a stadium, what would your ideal time to try to get a stadium open be?
These times, a couple of years.
Well, but when would you want it to have it opening? So say you kind of plan that. You say, yeah, well, we got to have it open by X. When would be a date? What time of year would you really want to have that stadium ready by?
October.
You'd want to have it ready by August where the football season starts. So you'd want to do it when football season. So if you're building the temple, what kind of event would you want to have the temple ready for its opening? I guess if you want to call it that.
Their main spiritual holiday.
One of their big festivals, one of their big feast days. So there are 3 to choose from. And of course, some of that's probably when you start stuff. But, all males, according to Exodus 23, all males were required to be at the place the Lord designated, which we can establish that. I'll show the scripture references that shows this. But it would be where originally the tabernacle was, where the Ark of the Covenant was. But then eventually God chose Jerusalem to put his name there. And so the temple would be built in Jerusalem as a result. So 3 days out of the year, all men were required to be present. One of them was the feast of Passover or unleavened bread, depending on what you want to call it. One of them was exactly 50 days from the Sabbath of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which was Pentecost, or it was also called Feast of Weeks because it was 7 weeks plus a day. And then the other feast was the Feast of Booths or Ingathering. And so those were the 3 most important religious holy days that they would observe. And so you would want to have it ready for one of those, right? I mean, because then you would have a dual purpose. Everybody would be there. They would offer the sacrifices and dedicate the temple. So in 1 Kings 8, it says, Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. I thought this might be the first time that Zion is referenced this way. And so you can do a little research, like it says Zion 44, 48. May not be in yours because this is an archaeological section. But Zion is simply the Temple Mount area, or what sometimes we refer to as Mount Moriah. They're all the same. So Zion, Temple Mount, Mount Moriah is the same. In fact, even in today's times, if you are considered a supporter of Israel, what are you called by especially the Palestinians? It's a negative term to them, but I guess, I don't know. So if you're a supporter of Israel, you're called a Zionist, which that's just the location of the Temple Mount in that area. So this is where they all were coming, the Ark of the Covenant. Now, David had brought the Ark of the Covenant. It was already in the Jerusalem area. Remember, he had he failed his first attempt and then realized they didn't do it the way God wanted, and he succeeded on the second attempt. So anyway, and all the men of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the feast in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. Now, we're going to back up just a little bit. Ethanim. I don't know the months of the Hebrew calendar, You can go to months in 2398 on your Thompson chain, and it gives you a listing of the months. But what's better if you've got it, yours may not, y'all's large print may not have it. Turn to 4451, and it is a table or chart. Y'all, if you don't have that, turn to the 2398, but 4451.
That's what 40.
4451.
Yeah. I don't get that. Sorry.
It'll be at the very end of the archaeological thing, and it's the Hebrew calendar, and it's a table. But y'all's may not have that, and if not, turn to 2398. Oh, you've got it. Okay. You found it. That's what you were looking for right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a different number because y'all don't have the archaeological stuff. What number is that for Dale to know?
4311.
Yeah. So y'all's don't have the archaeological stuff.
44.
4451.
Yeah. I ran out of. I got 4450.
You're really close then. Keep going. One more page. You'll be there. There you go. Okay.
Oh, that's
So-
51.
4451.
Okay.
You find it, Dale?
Yeah.
So, why is the Hebrew calendar not like our calendar?
The moon, didn't
Okay, it was a lunar
Mhm.
calendar. We are under a solar calendar. Does that mean their calendar's wrong? Well, not necessarily. It kind of works as good. Think about this. Okay, so which is easier to observe in the ancient days? Okay, say you were a chicken farmer back in the biblical times.
25.
Yeah. Which is easier to keep track of? Get you which they didn't even have, in fact, hadn't been invented yet, a telescope or something, and observe the solar observations, and then come up with a table over, number of years, and be able to determine that we're spinning around the sun and do all these heavy mathematical calculations and figure out based on where the sun is and where it's at, be able to determine what day of the year you're in. Or is it just a lot easier to say, well, that's a full moon there, and then it goes through its cycle, and there's another full moon every 28 days. It's pretty consistent, and say, hey, well, let's base our calendar on that. What's the drawbacks of a lunar calendar?
I don't know. We always say the full moon, the deer's out.
The deer's out. Well, I don't know. Maybe they were. I hadn't heard that one. So what?
you have more months, or more.
What would be the drawback? Yeah. So which one's actually more accurate, I guess, if you don't get down to, because what is a year? Well, a year technically is how long it takes the earth to go around the sun. Okay. So, the 28 days, 12 times a year, it doesn't get there. So now,
Right.
yeah, it is your time to go.
Let's get out of here.
Gene got to go with you.
I can take him home.
You want to go home with me, or you want to? I gotta go.
Or Larry can take you.
Back that way, or you going out here?
I'm going home.
You went home?
Going home and get my
Okay.
wife.
Or you could go with Larry. Larry
I
take
can
you.
take you home later.
I'll ride with him. He's going that way.
He don't trust you, Larry. No.
I don't blame him.
Tater knows how to get there.
He's spoke a mistake.
Okay, well, we'll pause for a second, and we'll be thinking what the drawbacks of the lunar calendar. We
Lose all my gold. Yeah.
we take good care of it. If you leave it,
You guys take care of it.
we'll take it. Yeah.
Sorry, I had to run, but that's what
That's hey, you showed up.
what I told you. I mean,
Yeah, I did my part. I made the coffee.
yeah. Appreciate it.
No problem. I'll take care of them chickens.
I think I go for a snack. He said, "You get here. We're gonna eat 1 o'clock." I said, "Well, Nancy, you get up there, you got to wait 30 minutes or an hour."
I know. That's if you're lucky.
All right,
We'll see.
I was going to tell him his ass on the floor.
Oh well, kicking it around. So okay. So what would be the drawback? Obviously, you get off, would you not? I mean,
Yeah.
So these lunar calendars, they were meant to be, certain times of the year. So eventually, your springtime wouldn't be your springtime. So you would get off over a long period of time. Now, how do you think they rectified that? And it might not be in this one. Let's see. Let's look at this month's 2398, see if it shows it. How would you rectify it? Let me give you a little hint how you would.
I'm sure at that time, best way would be to stop.
So,
Thanks.
so is it exactly
It's not exactly.
365 days?
No.
But yeah, that's how many's on our calendar, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we rectify it?
I just look at the calendar.
Isn't it like every 5 years?
Well, it's every 4 years, although we'll talk about that too. Just yeah, we have a leap year. Now, what they would do, and it's not on this. I'll find it for next year. Okay, so well, anyway, they had a Viadar or the second Adar.
Yeah.
They would insert a month. Let's see, 13 months, 7 out of the side of 19. So 7 out of 19 years, they'd have a 13 months in order to correct, make up the time. So we have a leap year every 4 years.
Yeah.
Okay. However, so they first, through the calculations, determined that it was called the Julian calendar, I believe. Sometimes I get it backwards. There's the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar, and I think the Julian was the first one. It might have been Gregorian. But anyway, so what they determined was it was 365.25 is the number of days in a year. So every 4 years, they'd have a leap year, a day to get that to where it'd be right. They found out over almost actually about 1,500 years later, we're drifting. We're like they'd set Christmas, the Roman Catholic Church had set Christmas and other things. It's like, it's getting at a different time, as far as when the, sun's at the most winter time and stuff, those are changing. What's up? Well, turns out that it's not 365.25. It's like 365.2475 or something like that. And so somewhere they calculated, said, no, what we need to do is every 100 years that's not divisible or by 4. And I think actually the year 2100 is going to be the first one, the whole year when it's not divisible over 4. So 2100 will be a 4th year, but it will not have a leap year. So there are 3 dates out of 1,000 that will not have a leap year, and that is to rectify that it's not quite perfect. That apparently is close enough they don't have to do anything else. As a result, you get some strange things in history. For example, if you look up, if it's a really good history of them, you look up George Washington. He has 2 birthdays. And he has one birthday under the old system and one under the new system because Great Britain, England, they adopted the new calendar after he was born. And that's when the U.S. basically adopted it as well. It's before we became the United States. And so anyway, so it just shows you how it does. But this lunar calendar, nothing was wrong with the lunar calendar. And like I say, if you base it on back in the days when you didn't have computers, you didn't have telescopes, you didn't have advanced mathematics where you could do calculations of the trajectory of the sun and how it's moving around. As a result, you know, a lunar calendar made a lot more sense in the times of even of Solomon. So that's what they use. As a result, you see here, it was different. The first of the year wasn't January. The first of the year was actually Adar. And that was actually in February, March. And so as a result, it's different. So winter times were different. We've got our calendar where we think of it as being the way it is, but it wasn't. So that Ethanim was in September, October-ish. Well, why can't they just say it was October the 2nd? And the reason they can't say is the same reason you got issues today with when is Passover. Even on Easter, they had to figure up a way that they want to try to be as close to when it would have been, but yet you can't be exact because it changes because every year is different and you've got an odd number. And so as a result, lunar calendars, not only did they go, but they had to be adjusted every, how many it say? 7 out of 19 years, you had a 13th month. And so you can only get close. Now, any particular year you could calculate and see what it would be. But Ethanim, day 1 of Ethanim, you had the Feast of the Trumpets. Day 10, you had Day of Atonement. That was the day that the high priest could go into the most holy place. And then days 15 through 21, you had the Feast of Ingathering or Booths. What did they do on the Feast of Ingathering or Booths? It was to observe the harvest time, but yet it was also an homage to the days they wandered in the wilderness. So what would they do?
Little stick huts.
What would we call that today? They had cloth on the outside of them.
Yeah.
So what would we call that structure? A tent. So they would come to Jerusalem and pitch their little tents, and that's where they'd stay for that feast time. And it was to observe that's how they moved and lived for over 40 years. And so this is part of this feast. And so people would be there. So I just wanted to give a little history to that. But it was one of the feast days that they were required, all men were required to be there. So let's keep reading. Let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 8. So the King James Version calls it the Feast of Tabernacles. But what did we say? A tabernacle, what that word actually just means? Tent. So the Feast of Tents. So basically, that would be a rather odd sight Now, think about it. It would have looked a lot like it did when they were wandering in the wilderness, because in the New Testament times, I've read scholars and historians that say Jerusalem would swell on one of these main feast days from a population of about 50,000 in the first century, 55 I've seen, to 2 to 3 million. So you could imagine all these tents. Anyway, it would have been really a sight to behold, I guess. But anyway, so in verse 3 of 1 Kings 8, it says, "And all the elders of Israel came, and the priest took up the ark," okay, "and they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and the holy vessels which were in the tent." Well, how did they bring up the tent of meeting?
What was it?
In
What did you say?
How did they bring up the tent of the meeting or the tabernacle?
You carry it.
Had to carry it. Yeah, it was a tent. So basically, they put it all together, and well, why did they have to do that? It wasn't in the same location. I think it was in Gibeon at these times. And so why did they have to take it all there? What else was in there? What says the holy vessels were also in the tent? It says, "And the priest and the Levites brought them up." So why did they have to do that? Have any of y'all ever moved?
Mhm.
Do you just leave your stuff there and go into the new place, and whoever bought your place just you don't ever get in, is that what you did, or what did you do?
Kept everything.
Packed up everything. Why? Because the stuff that was at a place, you moved it to your new place because it was it had value to you. Maybe it was antiques. Maybe it was just didn't have any way to get any other furniture. Maybe, whatever, your prized possessions. So they had to move this because the temple is now there. And that's where all these holy vessels, all this ornate stuff, all the candlesticks and other things that light up, all the ornate different inside, the cherubim, all this type stuff had to be moved from where the tent of meeting, and that had to be moved to the temple now. And so who was in charge of doing that? Well, it was the Levites. That was their mission. Now they're going to change now, David came up with what they were to do after this, but still that was their job, to transport the tabernacle. And so that's indeed what they did. And they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, all the holy vessels that were in the tent. Priests and the Levites brought them up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. It's a bunch. It had to have been a mess. Okay. So when you sacrifice an animal like this, what it's involved?
You got to bleed it.
Yeah. You butcher it. So
Then you butcher
so I can imagine it was a gruesome sight if you're looking at it from that standpoint, because here they are, all couldn't even number. There were so many. They were slitting their throats, killing them, bleeding them out, breaking them down, throwing them on the altar, one right after another. I mean, and where does this blood go? Well, they didn't have it. Like I said, it was probably a very gruesome sight. And it says, "Then the priest brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary in the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim." Now, I wanted to show this because some pictures, it's hard to get a good picture of Solomon's temple and some things, but just pass this around. This is from a New American Standard Study Bible that I've had. And you can see it kind of shows the different things that were there. You got the big altar. The altar was good size. I mean, I think sometimes we don't You got this sea water basin that they could wash themselves, and it was huge. But anyway, one of the things, the cherubim, I've seen a couple pictures now that show these cherubim. They weren't facing each other; they were facing towards where the curtain would have been. But the wings, where they about touched, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And but they were large. I can imagine when that high priest went in there, it was an awe-inspiring thing.
Yeah.
Now, I want to say this: that is some artist's rendition of what he believes it may have looked like. No one really knows for sure. We know the dimensions. We know where things were housed. We don't know exactly what these cherubim looked like. We don't know, like, in other words, I've seen some that will show this altar with the ramps to the side instead of in the front.
That next verse says that the cherubim spread out its wings over.
Yes, but how did it actually look? How did the cherubim
You
look?
imagine something like that, to cover.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
large, but like I say, as far as
Yeah.
exactly the way it looked,
Yeah.
it would just be a guesstimate.
Was that it? Is that it? There?
Yeah, that's the two cherubim. See,
That what?
that's the two cherubim. So you got
That's
one
what-
here and one there, and the wing, the Ark of the Covenant would have been underneath it. But that is an artist's idea, representation of what he thought it looked like.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying he's wrong, but the truth of the matter is we don't really know for sure. You know,
That's just like everybody tries to picture Jesus, what Jesus looked like.
yeah, that cracks me up too. You know, of course, now it's like, well, Jesus was brown skinned. I don't know if you've heard that and stuff. And so what does a Jewish person look like? Well, some of them are a little darker, but you know what? Some of them are a little lighter skinned too. What does an American look like? I mean, it's like, I have a good friend, Jerry Elder. He's been a youth minister. He was Haley's youth minister, but he's been a youth minister for years. He's a very well-known youth minister. He always called his youth group Jerry's Kids. But anyway, Jerry is an interesting guy, but he has a beard and he's dark-haired.
Well, I wouldn't
But-
have had any idea what a cherubim was, particularly, but I wouldn't have imagined it as an image of a animal of some kind with wings. But I wouldn't have had no idea.
Well, they're
if I
always
hadn't seen
depicted
that.
as having wings. Sometimes they're depicted as having various faces, like a face of a human, a face of an animal.
Bird or something,
Yeah,
you know,
well,
probably.
but they're a class of angels. Now, the first time we read about cherubim is in the Old Testament when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. Who guarded the garden?
Cherubim.
The cherubim did. Yeah. So in one sense, it's kind of fitting that these cherubim now are the guard of where God was to exist. And even in heaven, the throne scene, what is around the throne of God? Cherubim. So there's anyway. So Jerry Elder is from Oxford, Anniston area, Alabama, or L.A. as sometimes they'll call it because it's south of certain. Anyway, it's so his family has been from Alabama as long back as he can record. Church where I actually met Haley, large church. But anyway, they, after I think him and Ted had been there, Burleson had been there over 20 years, and they gifted them a trip, the church did, to the Holy Lands. And so they went to various places, including they went to Egypt during this time. Well, Ted didn't have any problems, but Jerry Elder, they'd been in Jerusalem area. They flew to Egypt, and he gets detained going into Egypt. You know why he got detained? Well, it wasn't necessarily the color of his skin. They said, you look like you're Jewish. And they wanted to make sure. And so it happened to be on a weekend. And so the American consulate wasn't open. And so he was detained for almost 24 hours until the American consulate opened, and they could confirm that he was indeed a American citizen born and raised in Alabama. My point to what you're saying, people that try to say, even today they go the other way. Well, yeah, he didn't have blue eyes, he didn't have blonde hair and stuff like that. But as far as it goes, I think Jesus looked just like any regular guy. If he was around today, you wouldn't say, "Oh, there's a Jewish person," or "There's a whatever," just a regular looking guy, fit in any crowd. That's my belief based on what Scripture says. And
Yeah, that's
you wouldn't have said, "Well, he's X, Y, or Z." But the point is, a Jewish person, there isn't. And by the way, even an Arab person, there's not a lot of difference between the Jews and Arabs in that you go back far enough, they have the same lineage. But a lot of it is how they dress, and that's what people perceive as, well, the area is Jewish or whatever. But anyway, so we don't know. We don't know. And so anybody that draws any kind of picture, I've seen this representation shows, well, this is what Jesus would look at. It's a computer, how do you know? I mean, no one knows for sure. So he could have looked like, anybody. In fact, the people that say they're Jewish today cannot even actually trace their lineage anymore. So who's to say 1,000 years ago that their parents were not Jewish and they become proselytes, and over time, who's to say that they have any what's called Jewish blood in it? In fact, there's always been this debate: is being Jewish, is it ethnicity or is it a religion? And it's more of a religion than it is an ethnicity, if you want to get down to it, because they can no longer really trace their time, and they've been so dispersed that there's been so much intermarriage that no one really knows. That's kind of like most Americans. We're kind of hybrids. Most of us are. I don't know. Do you know your lineage? What kind of background you are?
no.
Do you know what kind of background you are as far as ethnicity?
Some, yes.
Some. Okay. What are you?
Welch.
Welch. Oh.
We descended from Wales, England.
Oh, okay. Well, that's cool. It'd be cool if you could speak it.
One side German,
Well,
the
I
other
was
side.
close. I went to London one time, and that's not too far from
No,
where
but
Wales is, I think.
it's an interesting group of people because London, England is really fascinating because it's not that big, but yet they have these pockets that are so different. And the Welsh, Wales, they speak their own language. It's not really their own language. It's actually the ones that are native and traditional. They speak basically Middle English still.
I know it goes back to before we had surnames.
Yes.
And the surname Pryor came from the English church. And in that church, they had what they called the priory.
Yep.
And so they shortened it up, and it is spelled in two different ways.
A lot of English names are,
way they spell it over there, I noticed when I was there, is Pryor, just like I do,
Right.
Then they have made some kind of a change somewhere along the lines of Prior.
Yeah. That's kind of common. A lot of names. So I'm the Bradshaw side, in which my kids want me to do a DNA test, but I don't know if it's going to show anything because most of the DNA tests only go back so far. So Bradshaw's, there's two lines of, but they both date back to, which I joke about now. I say, well, we're Vikings because indeed that's where the origins of the Bradshaw name come from, was from Vikings. But the Vikings would raid quite often. In fact, I think a third of people in England now actually have Viking descent of blood in them because they actually ran the country for a while. And but anyway, so they raided, and Bradshaw settled in England, and they settled in Ireland. And so there's still a lot of Bradshaws in both of those. And so I'm from one of those. But my mom's
Yeah.
maiden name was Olive, so she was Greek.
My mother was Alexander.
Yeah.
And I think that is Scottish, but I'm not sure. Or Ireland.
So anyway, but it's neat. But the point is, you don't see someone unless they have been a immigrant of recent where they have an accent. You can't tell by looking at anybody. You really can't. One thing that even a lot of people that are African American, Black, there is a big difference in people like from the Sudan as people from the Zaire, and I mean a lot of those things. There's totally different, a lot of differences. In fact, if you do a DNA test, it's going to let you know kind of, depending on which group you may have come from. But the point is, a lot of this stuff is estimates. However, we know the dimensions, and we know what it looked like. We know a lot of details, but we don't know. They just had a camera back then. That would be. Didn't have cameras, so so as I say, a lot of it's estimates. But anyway, we'll end there, and we'll pick up next week as God's presence is going to fill the temple. As soon as they leave, the people leave because it wasn't time for the high priest to be there. As soon as they leave, God fills the temple, and this doesn't happen. It happened when the tabernacle was instituted, happened when the temple was, but it doesn't happen when the temple's rebuilt. Just a point of clarification. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the stream, and then we can talk